Hey everybody, Rob Purdy, Blast and Cast Men's Ministry. Today we're going to recap week 2 of the God and Guns Bible Reading Challenge. You might notice that the background has changed a little bit. This week I'm in Anchorage, Alaska, doing a mission trip with my church. I hope you have the opportunity to serve with your church in missions somewhere around the world. It's a great way to see how God's moving in other communities. Before we even get into the recap, I do want to say something. Today is day 15. You're 25% of the way through the Bible Reading Challenge. And on day 15, we decided, because of a generous donor, that we would do a special drawing for a rifle I'm going to tell you about. For those of you who marked on our original survey having never read the Bible or never read or very seldom read, those two lowest categories of frequency in reading. So if that's you, you should have received an email today asking if you've been reading. And if you respond to that email, you'll be part of the drawing that I will do live next Monday night. If you are in that category and you did not receive the email, please reach out to us and let us know. We are aware that several of the people who have registered with the Blast and Cast Challenge, the Reading Challenge, the God and Gun Challenge, are not receiving the emails as they should. We address these issues as quickly as we can, but we know they're there. So if you should have got an email and you didn't, you need to reach out. We need you to respond by the end of the week, and then your name will be in the drawing. I'll do that drawing live for a Browning X-Bolt 6.5 Creedmoor rifle with a scope. It's an awesome gun. Whoever wins it, it's going to be great. All right, let's get into this recap. I don't want to take much of your time. I do want to say this. If you have fallen off the reading wagon, if you missed today, don't let that end your participation in the challenge. Pick up your Bible and begin reading with us every day from this point forward. So let's go back to where we started in week 1. We went from the fall of man, creation, and the fall of man, and Abraham, and Sodom, and Gomorrah, and Isaac, and Rebekah, and Jacob, and Esau. And the takeaway from week 1 was we had Genesis 3:15, the first preaching of the gospel, the promise of a deliverer, of a redeemer that would come. We had God's unilateral covenant with Noah. God said that he would never flood the earth again. We had another covenant, God's unilateral covenant with Abraham, promising him land and descendants and a blessing. And then we follow God's covenant with Abraham through his son Isaac and his sons Jacob and Esau. So our second week, last Monday, our reading picked up with Jacob and Esau. 20 years had passed since Jacob was able to take away Esau's blessing. You might remember that story. And God actually had told Rebekah that this was going to happen. He told Rebekah in Genesis 25:33, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So we see what God told Rebekah had come to pass with Jacob and Esau. So for 20 years, Jacob had been basically hiding from Esau, since Esau had decided that he wanted to kill his brother. So the question is, after these 20 years, has Esau's attitude changed at all? Because Jacob's going to see Esau. He was pretty worried about the attitude he was going to run into, so he prepared for the worst. He divided his company into 2. That way, if one of them was attacked, the other one could get away. And if you remember, he sent gifts forward, trying to, plow the field, so to speak. And because he knew that Esau was coming, he had 400 men with him. And the day before that big meetup, he ends up wrestling in his tent all night long with an angel of the Lord. The New King James Version actually uses the word, the man that he wrestled. It capitalizes the word man there. Any idea who that is? Well, Jacob thought it was God. Here's what Jacob said. He said in verse 30 there, so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. So what was the point of that wrestling match? I mean, couldn't God, beat Jacob in a wrestling match like 10 out of 10 times? The wrestling match seems to be for the purpose of strengthening Jacob's resolve to follow God. The match is a draw, and Jacob is asking for a blessing, and he gets a blessing from God. And not only does he get the blessing that he asked for, he gets a name change. God changes his name to Israel. And all's well that ends well. Jacob and Esau meet. Jacob departs the meeting and buys a piece of property near Shechem where he settles down. So, back in the land, My brother no longer wants me dead. Got me some property. What could possibly go wrong now? An altar was constructed, the Bible says, and that altar it was given a unique name. So unique that all the English translations simply give it the transliterated Hebrew name, which is El Elohe, Israel. The word El, shortened form of the word God. And Elohe, the variation of Elohim, which we spoke about in Genesis chapter 1, the name of God. This place has been translated, if you translate it literally, God, the God of Israel. So the name of that altar could be declaring that from this time forward, the God of this land would be the God of Israel. So we picked the story back up day 2 with Jacob's sons, all 12 of them. The second youngest of those, his name is Joseph. And remember, after the wrestling match we talked about, Jacob was given the name Israel. Now listen to Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So little brother is the apple of dad's eye. Then he had a dream. And he tells his brother the dream. And the dream, you didn't have to be a genius to figure out that the dream showed that the brothers were all bowing down to the little brother. And then he has another dream. And he tells that dream to his dad. And this dream showed his parents and his brothers bowing down to him. His brothers are away, and Israel sends Joseph to find his brothers. And we got some good news and we got some bad news. The good news is he was able to find his brothers. The bad news is he found his brothers. Because the brothers had decided that they were going to do him in. They had a plan to kill him. And what ends up happening is that instead of killing him, he's sold to Egyptians and taken into Egypt. Off to Egypt he goes. Now, not part of our reading, but Joseph gets bought when he gets to Egypt by a man named Potiphar, who's the captain of the guard. And his wife tried to seduce Joseph, and Joseph runs off and doesn't fall for that. She yells rape, and Joseph ends up in prison. And this is important because while he's in prison, he becomes a leader, actually on behalf of the jailers in prison. But he meets two guys there, and he interprets two dreams for them, a baker and a butler. And his interpretation predicted that the butler would be restored to his position and the baker was going to be hanged, and that is exactly what happened to the two of them. And that was the end of the day 2 reading. Then day 3, Pharaoh has some dreams, and nobody could interpret them. But the butler, remember the one that was in prison with Joseph? The butler remembered Joseph in the dungeon, and that he had interpreted his dream. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and he interprets the dream, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of drought. So what Pharaoh does is he appoints Joseph as second in command of all of Egypt. And then he immediately, Joseph starts putting away grain in all the cities, preparing during the time of plenty, preparing for the drought that was to come. And then day 3 picks up with Genesis 42 through 45. We call it a family reunion. The famine that the dreamer predicted, the famine hits. Egypt has grain. Jacob sends the boys to buy some grain from Egypt because everybody heard that the only place you could get grain now was in Egypt. But what he did is he kept his youngest son, Benjamin, home. And then God's purpose all starts to become clear. Joseph recognizes his brothers when they show up to buy grain, but they don't recognize him. So he accuses them of being spies. He knows they're not. And he says, in order to prove that you're not spies, I want to keep one of you here. Actually, he's one of the brothers named Simeon. And you all go home, get your younger brother, the one that was left, you told me about him, and bring your younger brother here. Then I'll know you're not spies. Well, Jacob, he's not too happy about that deal. And when the brothers arrive back, minus Simeon, he says, I'm not sending Benjamin. I already lost Joseph because he thinks Joseph is dead. Says, I've already lost Joseph, and now I've lost Simeon. He's in Egypt. And then when they come back, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. What a reunion. Verse 7. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and the Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. The brothers go tell Dad the good news that Joseph is alive, and he says, my son is alive. I'm going to see him before I die. Let's go to Egypt. And that is how the Israelites get to Egypt. What I wanted you to see here, what we wanted you to see here, is that Joseph is a type of Jesus. And if you remember, I talked about this last week. The Bible teaches with types and pictures of the Messiah to come and events that are to happen, a foreshadowing, if you will, of what's going to happen. Do you see the similarity? Joseph is a type of Jesus. His brethren saw him from far off, and they conspired to kill him, just like the Jews who conspired to kill Christ. He was carried into Egypt, just like Jesus was carried into Egypt when he was a child. And after Joseph was liberated, that was a picture of a redeemer. There's all these similarities there. The list is long, and I'm not going to go over them now. But Jesus is a picture, or Joseph is a picture of Jesus. In fact, the entire Bible, from cover to cover, points to Jesus. We're going to see this type of typology over and over again. In fact, the next person we run into our reading is another type of Jesus. This man's name is Moses. And we're trying to foreshadow here Jesus in our reading. So, Moses, born in captivity in Egypt, actually had been some 400 years had passed from the time of Joseph to the time of Moses. And once the Pharaoh of Joseph's time died, the Jews began to fall into disfavor, and eventually they fell into slavery. Pharaoh would decree that during the time of Moses that all the male children of the Jews to be killed. So Moses was hid when he was born, and eventually he was put into a basket and reared alongside of the Nile, and he was found and ended up in the household of Pharaoh's daughter. And when he grows up, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, interferes, and he ends up killing the Hebrew, and he's afraid that word was getting out about this, which it was. So he fled to Midian, and he finds some women there in Midian gathering water from a well, and he saves them from being harassed by shepherds and helps them out. He ends up going with the women to their father's camp, and he stays with them and ends up marrying one of his daughters. Meanwhile, in Egypt, things had continued to get worse. For the Hebrews there, the slavery was getting worse until verse 24 of Exodus chapter 2, we find this. Now listen for the word covenant. Remember, we're following God's promise to Abraham. And God heard their groaning, speaking of the Hebrews, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And then in Exodus chapter 3, Moses, he sees the bush. Listen to this. It says, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Now, angel of the Lord is a term that we're going to see frequently in the Old Testament, and it's Jesus or God. It's actually called theophany. If it's an appearance of God in the Old Testament, it's a theophany. If it's especially Jesus, it's called a Christophany, an appearance of Jesus before the incarnation. That was when he was born in Bethlehem. So what we have here is a theophany. The bush is burning, and it's not being consumed. And then out of that bush, God speaks to Moses, and he tells him, you need to go to Egypt and tell the people that God sent him. And Moses says, well, who am I to tell my people? They're going to ask me your name. And God says, tell them, I am that I am. God's eternal name, God's sovereign name, God's holy name, God's self-existent name. I am that I am. And he was to tell Pharaoh that he was to let the people go. It's a great movie. You ought to see it. In the next day's reading, we find that a series of plagues had been sent upon the Egyptians, and Pharaoh had refused to let the people go. So we come to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. And now we see a picture of Jesus. We've seen two types of Jesus in Joseph and Moses, and this week we're now going to see a picture of Jesus, the Passover lamb. Listen to this. Verse 21, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, and dip it in the blood, and that is in the basin, and strike the lintel, that's the covering of the door of his house, and the two doorposts with blood, that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of this house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your house to strike you. After that night, Pharaoh relents and he lets them go. And the Israelites, the Hebrews, they take with them riches of Egypt, just as God said they would. And God leads them into wilderness, and he leads them with a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke across the desert to the Red Sea. He provides food. He provides water. Now, meanwhile, Pharaoh, he decided that he was going to move against these Hebrews that he just let go. So he sends 600 chariots after them. And he has them pinned up against the Red Sea. And boy, did the Hebrews complain. And then God moved again. The Bible says an angel of the Lord moved the pillars of fire and smoke from the front of the Israelites to the back of the Israelites to separate them from the Egyptian army. And then Moses lifted up his rod, just as the Lord had told him to do, and the Red Sea split. And all the Hebrews crossed on dry ground across the Red Sea. And then as the Egyptians pursued them, God caused the sea to collapse on the Egyptians and drown them all. And that's how that day's reading ended. They believed the Lord. They believed Moses. I mean, really? Who wouldn't, right? I mean, you just walked across the sea on dry ground, looked over your shoulder, and an army behind you of chariots is totally consumed by water. This is a picture of baptism, by the way, as the Hebrews went through the water. But you would think after seeing that they would never, ever doubt the Lord again, right? I mean, would you? But. And then the last reading of the week was God gives them the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments. That's all. Just 10. You think after seeing what God had done in the deliverance from Egypt, what God had done in the parting of the Red Sea, that they'd have no problem following 10 simple commandments. Before we end, let me ask you this. If you had seen all those things yourself, would you have any problem following the 10 Commandments? If you've done today's reading already, you know what happens next. And if you haven't, you still got time to do it. But that's where we'll end today. We have now completed 25% of the 60-day God and Guns Bible Reading Challenge. Congratulations. I want to encourage you to stay with it. We'll be doing our 30-day drawing. In 2 weeks, we'll be halfway through the reading. You all can do this. You will be blessed by this reading habit. Thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate it very much. That'll end our broadcast for tonight, and I'll come back to you with a live drawing for those that are responding to the email coming today next week back in Texas. Thank you, everybody.